London, the Palladium, July 28th, 1974. The house lights dim and the audience settles into that particular quiet that precedes something expected to be very good. When Cass Elliot walks out, the applause begins before she reaches the microphone. She is 32 years old and she has been performing since she was a teenager, and she knows exactly what to do with a room like this. She smiles, she opens her mouth. The sound that comes out is, by every account left behind by people who were there, extraordinary. She would do this 14 more times over 2 weeks, every seat, every night, filled. What the photographs from those evenings show is a woman who appears genuinely to be enjoying herself. Not performing enjoyment, actually inside it. Her hands move when she sings. She laughs between songs. She tells the audience things about herself that sound like confessions but land like punchlines, and the audience laughs with her and she laughs back. And for those 2 hours each night, the transaction seems entirely mutual. 4 days after the final performance, she was found dead in the borrowed London flat of Harry Nilsson. The story that spread within hours, the one that most people still know, was wrong. It has remained wrong for 50 years. That it spread so quickly and held so long and was so readily believed says something about how Cass Elliot had always been seen, not as a woman, as a type, as a joke that happened to be able to sing. This is where that began. Baltimore, Maryland, in the 1940s and early 1950s, was not a city that rewarded difference. It was a city of neighborhoods with clear borders, of families that understood their position and stayed inside it, of children who learned early that visibility of the wrong kind was a liability. Ellen Naomi Cohen was born on September 19th, 1941, the first child of Philip Cohen and Bess Levine. Philip ran a deli. Bess ran the household. The family was Jewish, working class, and by most accounts functional in the way that families are functional when everyone agrees not to examine certain things too closely. Ellen was a large child. Not unusually so at first, but noticeably so by the time she entered school and unmistakably so by the time she reached adolescence. In a culture that had already decided what girls were supposed to look like and had already built an entire architecture of social reward and punishment around that image, this was not a neutral fact. Well, it shaped every room she entered before she opened her mouth. What she did with her mouth from very early on was sing. By the accounts of childhood friends and her own later interviews, Ellen Cohen was performing almost as soon as she could speak in complete sentences. Not shyly, not tentatively, but with a kind of commitment that made people stop and pay attention despite themselves. There are stories of her singing in the family living room, in school hallways, at neighborhood gatherings with a seriousness of purpose that seemed slightly too large for the contexts she was placed in. She was not performing for approval exactly, though approval was clearly part of it. She seemed to be practicing at something, getting ready for somewhere else. Her mother, Bess, was by multiple accounts a cold and critical presence. And this is the kind of biographical detail that is easy to overuse. The difficult mother, the withholding parent, the wound that explains everything. And it should be treated carefully. But the specific shape of Bess Cohen's coldness matters here. It was not violent or dramatic. It was quiet and consistent, the kind of disapproval that expresses itself through silences and comparisons and a persistent sense that the child in front of you is not quite the child you had in mind. Ellen was loud. Bess valued restraint. Ellen was large. Bess valued presentation. Ellen wanted to be seen. Bess found wanting to be seen vaguely embarrassing. Philip Cohen was warmer, and Ellen was closer to him. He encouraged her performing, attended her school productions, laughed at her jokes. Yeah, when she was a teenager, he would be diagnosed with a brain tumor and die, and the loss would sit inside her for the rest of her life, in a way she returned to repeatedly in interviews, always with the same quality of incompleteness, as though she was still trying to figure out what it had taken from her. She attended Forest Park High School in Baltimore, where she was, depending on which account you read, either beloved or merely tolerated. Both are probably true in the way that things are true in high school. The class clown is beloved and tolerated simultaneously. the bigness of her personality covering for the bigness of her body, the laughter she generated functioning as a kind of ongoing negotiation with a social world that had already placed her outside its inner circle. She was funny, genuinely funny, not just loud. She understood timing in a way that suggested she had been studying audiences since childhood, learning what made people lean in and what made them step back. But funny has a cost, particularly for girls and women in that era and in most eras. To be the funny one is to accept a particular role in the social ecosystem, the one who makes others comfortable, the one who deflects tension, the one who is present to serve the mood of the room rather than to have needs of her own met. Ellen Cohen accepted this role early, possibly because it was the only one on offer, possibly because it gave her something that looked like belonging, even if it did not feel entirely like it on the inside. After high school, she briefly attended American University in Washington, D.C., then dropped out. The official reason shifts depending on the source. What is consistent is that by the late 1950s and early 1960s, she was moving, physically, socially, professionally, towards something she could not yet name but was clearly chasing. New York was the destination. The folk music scene was beginning to organize itself around coffee houses and small venues in Greenwich Village, and it was drawing a specific kind of young person, idealistic, restless, literary, convinced that music could carry meaning that the mainstream culture was refusing to hold. Ellen Cohen arrived in New York and inserted herself into that world with the same combination of force and need she had brought to every room since childhood. She changed her name. Ellen Cohen became Cass, drawn, reportedly from a combination of admiration for the actress Cass Daly and a character in a novel. The name change was not unusual among performers of that era, but it was also not nothing. Ellen was the name her mother had given her. Cass was the name she gave herself. The distance between them was the distance she was trying to travel. She found work in small theatrical productions, in folk groups, in the orbits of people who were slightly more established than she was and who she attached herself to with an intensity that could read as affection but was also clearly strategic. Not cynically strategic, she was not a cold person, but she understood that proximity to talent and opportunity was how you moved, and she moved deliberately. In Washington, D.C., she became part of a folk trio called the Big Three with Tim Rose and James Hendricks. The group recorded, toured modestly, dissolved. When these early configurations are less important as career milestones than as patterns. In the Big Three, as in nearly every professional relationship she would have in the years that followed, Cass was the largest presence in the room and somehow not the one in charge. She contributed more than her official role suggested. She was managed rather than leading. The shape of this would repeat. Her father died in 1960. She was 19. The accounts of this period suggest she did not slow down, if anything, the opposite, filling the years immediately following his death with more movement, more performance, more people. Whether this was grief expressed as velocity or simply who she was, the effect was the same. She kept going. She kept looking for the room where being Cass Cohen or Cass Elliot or whoever she was becoming and would finally be enough. The folk scene that Cass Elliot entered in the early 1960s had a particular idea of itself. It believed it was outside the machinery of commercial music. It believed it was political, authentic, concerned with truth in a way that pop radio was not. It gathered in small venues and cold apartments and late-night conversations that went on until someone had to leave for a day job, and it produced, in those years, a remarkable amount of genuine talent. It also produced a remarkable amount of social hierarchy dressed up as egalitarianism, who was considered serious, who was considered decorative, who was invited to the table and who was allowed to sit near it. These distinctions existed in the folk world as clearly as anywhere else. They were simply less openly acknowledged. My Cass arrived into this world without the physical presentation the scene had quietly decided it preferred. The folk aesthetic of the early 1960s favored a particular kind of female performer. Slight, ethereal, dark-haired or golden-haired in a way that suggested fragility, voices that seemed to carry sorrow without effort. Joan Baez, Judy Collins, Mary Travers. These were women whose appearance matched a certain idea of what female feeling was supposed to look like. Cass's voice was, by any technical measure, as good as any of theirs. Her range was wider than most. Her ear was precise and instinctive. None of this translated automatically into the same kind of regard. What she received instead was a different kind of attention. She was vivid, entertaining, hard to ignore. People wanted to be around her. She generated warmth in rooms the way certain people do. Not performed warmth, but the kind that makes other people feel more comfortable in their own skin. This was genuinely valued. It was not the same as being taken seriously. In Washington, D.C., before the Big Three fully coalesced, she moved through several overlapping social circles simultaneously. She was introduced to Denny Doherty, a Canadian folk singer of considerable charm and somewhat less considerable reliability, through mutual musical acquaintances sometime around 1963. Doherty was handsome in the specific way that the early 1960s found handsome, angular, easy in his body, possessed of a natural lightness that made people want to be near him without knowing exactly why. Cass was drawn to him immediately and completely. As this is documented not through speculation but through her own words, repeated across multiple interviews over the following decade, always with a quality of candor that suggested she had never fully resolved what she felt. Doherty did not return her feelings romantically. This was clear relatively early. What was less clear, and what would remain unresolved for years, was what he did return. Genuine affection, real friendship, the kind of closeness that can coexist with romantic rejection in ways that make the rejection harder to process rather than easier. He liked her. He enjoyed her company. He sang with her in a way that produced something genuinely beautiful. He simply did not want her the way she wanted him, and he was not particularly careful about demonstrating this through his behavior with other women in her presence. She stayed anyway. This is the detail that matters. She reorganized herself around his proximity, accepted the terms he offered, and built her emotional life in the years that followed, partly around a man who had made his position clear and would not change it. This is not a character flaw in any simple sense. It is a pattern that forms when someone has learned, over a long time, that the version of belonging that is on offer is incomplete, and that incomplete belonging is still preferable to none. The Big Three recorded an album in 1963 for FM Records. The reviews were modest. The commercial response was modest. The group toured, played the circuit of coffeehouses and small halls that constituted success at that level of the folk world. And then began the slow dissolution that comes when three people with different levels of ambition and different ideas about what they are doing realize they do not want the same things. Tim Rose was difficult, controlling about arrangements, insistent about direction. Cass pushed back more than the dynamic officially allowed for. When the group fell apart in 1964, it fell apart partly along those fault lines. What came next was a configuration called the Mugwumps, formed in 1964 with Doherty, Cass, and two others including Zalyanovsky, who would later co-found the Lovin' Spoonful. The Mugwumps recorded but did not release, performed but did not break through, and existed for less than a year before disbanding. The recordings would surface later after everyone involved had become famous through other configurations, and as a kind of archaeological artifact. Here is the moment before. Here is what it sounded like when these people were still finding out what they were. During this period, Cass was living the way young performers lived in New York and Washington in those years, cheaply, communally in apartments with too many people and not enough heat, sustained by the conviction that something was about to happen. She ate in the way that people eat when money is unreliable and meals are social rather than nutritional. Whatever was available, whenever it was available in the company of whoever happened to be there. The relationship between her body and her hunger was already more complicated than simple appetite, though the complication would not become publicly visible for several more years. She was managing her own bookings, her own logistics. her own finances with the erratic competence of someone who has never been taught how to do any of these things and is learning by sustained improvisation. There was no one looking after her interests. There was no infrastructure around her. There was talent and ambition and a social network built on genuine affection that was nonetheless not the same as professional support. She was, in every practical sense, alone inside the noise of belonging. In 1964, she married James Hendricks. Hendricks was her bandmate from the Big Three, a friend, a person she trusted. The marriage was, by her own later admission, largely a practical arrangement. She needed American citizenship documentation, or Hendricks did, depending on the account, and the marriage solved a logistical problem that their friendship made feel manageable. They did not live as a couple. They remained friends. The marriage was not dissolved for years, persisting quietly on paper while Cass's actual emotional life was organized around other people, other hopes, other versions of connection. That she entered a legal marriage as a bureaucratic convenience at 22 years old is the kind of detail that is easy to pass over. It should not be passed over. It suggests something about how she understood her own romantic prospects at that point. That the formal architecture of partnership was something she could deploy practically precisely because she did not expect it to be available to her emotionally. Other people got to marry for love. She married for paperwork. The transaction was clean, the friendship survived it, and something in the accounting of what she was owed was quietly adjusted downward. By 1965, she was in the Virgin Islands. Doherty was there. John Phillips was there with his young wife, Michelle. This was the convergence point, the moment when the people who would become the mamas and the papas were in the same place at the same time, trying to figure out what to do next. Cass had not been invited exactly. She had followed Doherty, which was the organizing logic of several of her movements in those years. She arrived into a situation that was already partially formed, with relationships and hierarchies already in place, and she inserted herself through the simple force of being impossible to ignore. John Phillips did not initially want her in the group. This is documented. His stated reason was musical. The harmonies he was constructing were built around 3 voices, and adding a 4th complicated the architecture. The actual geometry of his reluctance is harder to fully map, but it existed, and Cass knew it existed, and she stayed anyway and sang anyway and made herself necessary through the sheer quality of what she contributed until the reluctance became impractical to maintain. She was let in. She would spend the next several years discovering what being let in actually cost. The Mamas and the Papas signed with Dunhill Records in late 1965. Their first single, California Dreamin', was released in December of that year and began its climb up the charts in early 1966, eventually reaching number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. By the summer of 1966, the group was one of the most recognizable acts in American popular music. The speed of this was unusual even by the standards of an era that was producing sudden fame with some regularity. One year, they were 4 people in the Virgin Islands with no recording contract and uncertain prospects. The next, they were on television, on the radio, in magazines, their faces reproduced on a scale that made individual identity begin to blur into image. The image the group projected was specific and carefully constructed. They were bohemian, but not threatening. They suggested freedom, sexual freedom, social freedom, the freedom of California sunshine and easy living, without the harder edges that would make that freedom alarming to a mainstream audience. They wore flowers and fur and the kind of clothing that implied they had not thought too carefully about what they were wearing. The photographs from this period show 4 people who appear to be living inside a dream of themselves. John and Michelle Phillips at the center, golden and symmetrical. Denny Doherty to one side, charming and slightly unfocused. And Cass, large, laughing, draped in fabric that the photographers had learned to arrange in ways that minimized and managed, her face always animated, always performing the ease that was the group's central promise. She was the voice that made the group's sound possible. This is not a retrospective judgment. It was understood at the time by the musicians and producers who worked with them. Her ear was the most reliable in the group. Her pitch was almost never wrong. Nice in the studio, she was frequently the one who heard when a harmony was slightly off, who suggested the adjustment, who held the difficult note that gave the arrangement its particular quality of ache. Lou Adler, who produced the group's records, understood this. The session musicians understood it. It was not a secret among people who were paying attention to the music rather than to the image. What Cass received in exchange for this was not commensurate with what she contributed. The songwriting credits belonged almost entirely to John Phillips. Publishing revenue flowed accordingly. This was standard practice in the music industry of that era. The person who wrote the songs owned the songs, and the person who sang them owned a performance. That the performance was what made the songs what they were was not how the accounting worked. Cass was salaried as the others were, but the back end, the money that accumulates over decades as recordings are licensed, as songs are covered, as catalogs are sold, was not distributed along the lines of contribution. John Phillips ran the group. This was explicit rather than implicit. He wrote the material, controlled the sound, made decisions about recording and performance without the kind of collaborative negotiation that the group's image suggested. Michelle was his wife, which gave her a proximity to power that was also a form of dependence. Doherty deferred to Phillips in the way that charming, somewhat passive people defer to those with stronger organizational wills. Cass was the most likely to push back, and she did push back, and the pushing back was managed through a combination of dismissal and mockery that, because it happened in the register of humor, was difficult to formally object to. Her weight was a recurring subject, not occasionally, not in moments of particular tension, but regularly, as a kind of ambient material available for use whenever the atmosphere required lightening. John Phillips made jokes. Doherty made jokes. The jokes were not malicious in the way that requires intent. They were the jokes of people who had decided that a particular characteristic of a person they spent most of their time with was available for comic use, and who had not examined what that decision cost the person it was directed at. Cass laughed. She had been laughing at these jokes, or jokes structurally identical to them, since childhood. She knew how to absorb them without appearing to absorb them. The absorption was invisible to the people around her and evidently not invisible to her. There is a story from this period, reported in multiple accounts of the group's history, that John Phillips at one point told Cass she would need to lose weight before he would allow her to perform with the group on television. The specific details vary depending on the source, but the core of it, that her appearance was subject to his approval, that her participation was conditional on her body meeting a standard he set, appears consistently enough across different accounts to be treated as something that happened. She lost the weight, or some of it. She appeared on the television program. The contingency was accepted as a condition of employment. This moment is worth staying with. Cass Elliot was, at this point, a grown woman, a professional musician with years of experience, the possessor of a voice that was doing a significant portion of the work that was making all four of them famous and wealthy. She was told that her body was a problem requiring correction before she would be permitted to do the job she was already doing. She complied. The compliance was not a defeat exactly, or not only a defeat, it was also a survival skill, a version of the same skill she had been practicing in school hallways and living rooms and folk venues for her entire life. You absorb the condition, you meet it if you can, you stay in the room. The money arrived during this period in quantities that none of them had previously encountered. The group's earnings from 1966 and 1967 were substantial by any measure. Hit records, touring revenue, the particular multiplication that happens when fame compounds itself. Cass moved out of the communal living situations of her early 20s and into her own space in Laurel Canyon, the Los Angeles neighborhood that was becoming the residential center of the music world she inhabited. She bought a house. She furnished it. She began the process of constructing a physical environment that matched, at least spatially, the level of success she had achieved. The Laurel Canyon house became something specific in the social geography of that world. It was open. People came and went at all hours: musicians, writers, actors, the various satellites that orbit concentrated creative energy. Cass fed people, literally and otherwise. She cooked, she stocked the kitchen, she made the space feel inhabited in a way that people found irresistible. Graham Nash has spoken about this. David Crosby has spoken about it. The house is mentioned in multiple memoirs of that era as a place where something good was reliably happening, where you could arrive without an invitation and find warmth and food and conversation and music. What is less discussed in those accounts is what it cost to maintain that environment. Not financially, though the financial cost was real. The cost of being the person whose home is always open is the cost of never being entirely inside your own life. The people who came to Cass's house came for what the house offered: her generosity, her humor, her ability to make any gathering feel like something worth attending. They did not, for the most part, come to inquire about what she needed. The transaction ran one direction, and she had organized it that way. Possibly because she understood that the alternative, a closed door, a private life, the assertion of her own needs as primary, might result in the thing she feared most, which was an empty room. Michelle Phillips was having an affair with Doherty during this period. This was known within the group. The specific emotional geometry of this, Cass's feelings for Doherty, Doherty's involvement with the wife of the man who controlled their professional lives, the effect of all of this on the four people who were required to perform harmony together, is something that everyone involved has spoken about in the years since, usually with the lightness of retrospect that settles over old pain once enough time has passed. At the time, it was simply the water they were all living in. Cass was pregnant in 1967. The father of her daughter, Owen Vanessa Elliot, born April the 26th of that year, was not publicly identified by Cass during her lifetime. She raised Owen as a single mother without the scaffolding of a partner, while continuing to record and perform at the level her career demanded. The group's third album was released that year. She sang on it. She sang beautifully on it. She was doing two things at once that most people would find difficult to do separately, and she was doing them in an industry and a social world that provided no particular infrastructure for either. By 1968, the group was fracturing. The personal tensions, the affair, the resentments, the unequal distributions of credit and money had reached a level that the music could no longer contain. They recorded one more album, The Papas and the Mamas, which was released in the spring of 1968 to indifferent reviews. John and Michelle's marriage was ending. The group disbanded that summer, officially and without particular ceremony, as though they had all agreed not to make it into more than it already was. Cass was 26 years old. She had a 1-year-old daughter. She had a house in Laurel Canyon and money in the bank and a voice that everyone agreed was extraordinary. She had spent 3 years being essential to something that had never fully treated her as such. The group was over, and what came next was entirely her own, which was, depending on how you looked at it, either freedom or the beginning of a more sustained aloneness. The song was not meant to be hers. Dream a Little Dream of Me is not a 1960s composition. It was written in 1931. She recorded by Ozzie Nelson, covered intermittently over the following decades. A standard in the loose sense that standards accumulate, songs that persist, not because they are continuously popular, but because they are continuously available, waiting for someone to find a new angle on them. The Mamas and the Papas recorded a version in 1968, during the sessions for what would become their final album. The arrangement was John Phillips's. The production was Lou Adler's. The lead vocal was Cass's, and what she did with it was, by any reasonable measure, the most emotionally precise thing on the record. The decision to release it as a Cass Elliot solo single, her name alone on the label, beneath the group name in smaller type, was made by Dunhill Records with a commercial logic that had very little to do with recognizing her as an individual artist. The group was visibly disintegrating. A solo release allowed the label to extract additional revenue from an existing recording without investing in new material or navigating the increasingly complicated internal politics of a group that was no longer functional. Cass was the vehicle. The song was the product. The distinction between these two things was not something the label spent time examining. The single reached number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the spring of 1968. It was her first solo chart entry, and it arrived not as the result of a planned transition or a deliberate career strategy, but as a byproduct, something shaken loose from the wreckage of the group and released into the world while the wreckage was still settling. This is how her solo career began, not with a declaration or a fresh start or a label meeting where someone said, "We believe in you as an individual artist." It began with a song someone else had already arranged, from sessions already paid for, released because it was available and the timing was convenient. The reviews were warm. The phrase that recurred across different publications and different critics was some variation of the same observation, that Cass Elliot had a voice capable of more than the group format had allowed. This was true. It was also a slightly uncomfortable truth, because it implied that the previous 3 years had been, among other things, a form of containment, that something in her had been managed down to fit a configuration that needed her without fully accommodating her. The critics said this as a compliment. It was also an indictment, though of what or whom the reviews did not specify. She began recording a proper solo album in 1968. Dream a Little Dream was released that summer, a collection that drew on her range in ways the Mamas and Papas material had not. Show tunes, pop standards, contemporary compositions, arranged with a lushness that reflected both the production aesthetic of the moment and Cass's own instincts about what her voice could carry. She had opinions about the material. She had opinions about the arrangements. These opinions were sometimes accommodated and sometimes not, in the ratio that tends to apply when an artist is new to solo work and the infrastructure around them is composed of people who have already decided what they think the artist is. What the album is, listened to now, is the sound of someone being slightly mishandled by people who meant well. The production choices are not wrong exactly, but they are choices made around her voice rather than for it. Layered, cushioned, softened in ways that occasionally obscure the thing that made the voice interesting in the first place. There are moments where the arrangement steps back and she is simply there, unmediated. And those moments are noticeably different from everything surrounding them. They sound like the album that was not quite made. The press coverage that accompanied the release established a template that would persist for the rest of her career and well beyond it. Profiles of Cass Elliot in this period follow a recognizable structure. They begin with her laugh, her warmth, her conversational ease, all of which were real, all of which the journalists encountered genuinely and reported accurately. They proceed through her musical accomplishments, cited with genuine respect, but briefly. They arrive in almost every case at her body. The language varies, sometimes clinical, sometimes comic, sometimes framed as concern, but the arrival is consistent. Whatever else was said about her, the body was always part of the story. It was always, in some sense, the story the coverage was really about. She was aware of this. Her interviews from this period show a woman who had developed a precise set of responses to these questions. Responses that were funny, that deflected without appearing to deflect, that gave the journalist something quotable while revealing as little as possible about what it was actually like to be her. She had been doing this since high school. By 26, she had refined it into something nearly seamless. Nearly. In one 1968 interview conducted for a magazine whose name has been reproduced in various retrospective accounts, she was asked directly about her weight and her plans regarding it. Her answer was long, discursive, and ended with a joke that made the interviewer laugh. Somewhere in the middle of the answer, before the joke arrived to close things down, she said something brief and unguarded about how she had spent her whole life being told that the way she was the problem, and that she was tired. The interviewer included this in the piece. It appeared between two lighter observations and was not followed up. It sits in the transcript of the interview like a door that opened slightly and then closed. Her living situation during this period was organized around Owen, who was an infant and then a toddler, requiring the full logistical apparatus that children require and that Cass was providing alone. She had help. She had the money for help. But the primary responsibility was hers, and she carried it alongside a recording schedule and promotional obligations and the social life of Laurel Canyon, which did not slow down because she had a child. If anything, the house became more central to that world after Owen's birth, because Cass was less mobile, and so the world came to her instead. The question of Owen's father remained publicly unanswered. Various names were speculated about in the press and in the gossip that circulated through the music world. Cass declined every inquiry on the subject with a consistency that suggested the decision had been made deliberately rather than defensively, that there was a specific reason she wanted this particular information kept private, not merely that she found the question intrusive. The reason, whatever it was, died with her. She appeared on television variety programs throughout 1968 and into 1969, The Tonight Show, The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, others. These appearances were important for her solo profile, and she prepared for them with the thoroughness of someone who understood that television was a different instrument than a recording studio or a concert stage, that it required a particular calibration of self-presentation. She was good at it. The camera responded to her face in the way that cameras respond to faces that know they are being watched and have made a kind of peace with that knowledge. But the variety show circuit was also a context that kept her in a specific register: entertaining, warm, accessible, the kind of performer you were glad to see arrive on your screen after dinner. It was not the context that built the kind of career she might have been capable of building. It kept her visible in a way that also kept her contained, associated with a kind of pleasantness that was real but not complete, that suggested a range smaller than the one she actually possessed. A second album, Bubblegum, Lemonade, and Something for Mama, was released in 1969. The title is instructive. Someone, whether Cass or the label is not entirely clear, chose a title that leaned into the maternal warmth of her public image, the generous, feeding, nurturing persona that had already calcified around her. The music inside the album was more varied than the title suggested, but the title was what appeared on the shelf, on the advertisement, in the review headline. The title was the promise made to the audience about what kind of artist this was. It was a promise made partly at her expense. The album sold modestly. The reviews were mixed. The momentum that Dream a Little Dream had generated was not compounding in the way that first successes sometimes compound. The machinery of her solo career was running, but it was running slightly below the speed required to achieve escape velocity from the image problem. The persistent sense in how she was covered and marketed and positioned, that she was a supporting player who had been temporarily promoted, rather than a principal who had always belonged at the center. She was 27 years old, and she had been working continuously and seriously since her teens, and she had not yet made the record that matched what she was actually capable of. This was not for lack of trying. It was for lack of the specific combination of creative control, sympathetic production, and institutional support that allows a record like that to get made. These things were available in that era. They were available to certain artists. The criteria by which they were distributed were not neutral. Owen learned to walk in the Laurel Canyon house in 1968. Cass was there for this. Whatever else was happening, the career machinery, the press obligations, the social world flowing through the open door, she was there for this. The photographs from this period show her with her daughter with the same quality of genuine presence that the London concert photographs would show years later. Something fully inhabited, something that did not need to perform itself. The song had not been written for her. This is where it begins. Dream a Little Dream of Me was not a new composition in 1968. It had been written in 1931, recorded by Ozzie Nelson, covered by Doris Day, by Ella Fitzgerald, by Louis Armstrong, by enough people over enough decades that it had acquired the particular quality of songs that everyone knows without knowing they know them. When it appeared on the Mamas and the Papas album, Dream a Little Dream, released in 1968, it was because Cass had been performing it in her solo sets, and the people around her had noticed that something specific happened when she sang it. The song fit her voice the way certain songs fit certain voices. Not because the voice is generic enough to accommodate anything, but because something in the particular grain of the instrument matches something in the particular emotional temperature of the material. The record label's decision to release it as a Cass Elliot solo single, while crediting it to Mama Cass with the Mamas and the Papas, was a business decision made by people at Dunhill who understood that the group was effectively over and that Cass represented a commercial asset worth continuing to develop. The framing was cautious. She was not yet fully separated from the group's brand, was not yet fully launched as an individual, but was being tested in a space slightly outside the configuration that had made her famous. The song reached number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the summer of 1968. For a first solo release, for a woman who had been consistently positioned as one part of a larger whole, this was a meaningful result. What it was not was a clean break. The machinery of her solo career was built on the infrastructure of what she had already been. She was marketed as Mama Cass, the name carrying the group association that the label understood audiences would follow. The warmth and humor of her public persona were the product, the thing being sold. And that persona had been formed inside the group dynamic in ways that made it difficult to separate from its origins. She was not starting fresh. She was extending a thing that had already been shaped by other people's decisions about what she was and what she was for. She recorded her first proper solo album, Dream a Little Dream, through 1968. The production was handled by people she trusted, and some she was still learning to trust. And the result was a record that demonstrated the range she had never been fully permitted to show inside the group. There were ballads, and there were up-tempo tracks, and there were moments where the voice did things that the tight harmonic architecture of the Mamas and the Papas had not required of it, where it moved more freely, occupied more space, made decisions on its own. The album received warm reviews from critics who had always sensed that the group had been containing something. It sold, respectably. Respectably was not spectacularly. The machinery of the music industry in 1968 was not particularly designed to take a 26-year-old woman who had been famous as part of a group and rebuild her as a solo artist of equivalent stature. The pathways were narrow. The investment was cautious. As she was given opportunities and she was given constraints in roughly equal measure, and the constraints often operated along the same lines as the ones she had lived with inside the group: her appearance, her size, the question of how to present her to a mainstream audience that had absorbed her as a type rather than as a person. Television was the medium through which solo careers were built in that era, and Cass understood this and pursued it with the same deliberate energy she brought to most professional decisions. She appeared on variety shows, The Tonight Show, The Ed Sullivan Show, the kind of programs that delivered a specific kind of mass visibility, unavailable through any other channel. She was good at this. The camera responded to her face the way live audiences responded to her presence. Something in her was readable, accessible, impossible to look away from entirely. She told jokes. She sang. She was, in the language television used to describe its female guests, delightful. Delightful was the word that followed her. It appeared in reviews and profiles, in the descriptions her colleagues offered when asked to characterize her. It is worth paying attention to the specific content of that word. Delightful describes something that gives pleasure to others. It is a word about effect, about what is produced in the people around the subject. It is not a word about interior life, about complexity, about the cost of being the thing that produces delight in others. It is one of the most complete words available for describing someone without actually seeing them. In 1968 and 1969, she worked continuously. Recording, television appearances, concert dates, the sustained professional activity of someone who understood that momentum in the music industry was perishable and who could not afford, financially or psychologically, to let it lapse. Owen was a toddler. The domestic logistics of a single mother with a demanding touring and recording schedule were managed through hired help, nannies, assistants, the infrastructure of money applied to the problem of being one person who needed to be in multiple places simultaneously. This worked in a practical sense. What it meant for the texture of Owen's early childhood, for the quality of presence Cass was able to offer her daughter during those years, is harder to measure. She spoke about Owen constantly in interviews. The love was genuine. This is not a story about a woman who did not love her child. But genuine love and sustained presence are not the same thing, and the life Cass was living in those years did not leave significant room for the latter. She was on the road, in the studio, on television sets, in the professional social world that was her primary community. Owen was at home in Laurel Canyon with whoever had been engaged to be there. The gap between what Cass felt and what Owen experienced was the gap that the work created, and the work was not optional. Her second solo album, Bubblegum, Lemonade, and Something for Mama, was released in 1969. The title suggests the direction the label was pushing: warm, maternal, approachable, the musical equivalent of the persona that had been attached to her since the Mamas and the Papas. The album was less well received than the first. The critics who had been generous about the debut found the follow-up too commercial, too carefully aimed at a mainstream that was shifting beneath everyone's feet. 1969 was not 1966. The musical landscape had changed in ways that were difficult to navigate from the position she occupied, which was the position of someone whose public identity had been fixed at a particular moment and was now struggling against that fixity. She was aware of this. The interviews from this period show a woman who was thinking carefully about her career, who understood the problem she was facing, who was trying to find a way through it without the resources, the songwriting catalog, the production control, the back-end ownership. That would have made the navigation easier. She talked about wanting to act. She talked about wanting to do more serious dramatic work, to be taken seriously in a way that delightful had never quite permitted. These conversations appear in print across several years, always in the same register of aspiration slightly shadowed by awareness that the aspiration might not be achievable. The Laurel Canyon house continued to be open. The people continued to come. In 1969 and 1970, the gatherings there intersected with a music scene that was producing some of the most significant work of the era. Crosby, Stills, and Nash were forming. The Eagles were beginning to coalesce. Joni Mitchell was in the canyon writing the songs that would define her. Cass was present for much of this, a connective tissue in a community that was generating enormous creative and commercial energy. She knew everyone. She was liked by everyone. She participated in the music in informal ways, singing on sessions, contributing to recordings, being the person whose ear and judgment others trusted. She was not, during this period, the one whose name went on the record. There is a session from around 1969 where she contributed vocals to work being done by friends, the specifics of which have been described by people who were present as a demonstration of exactly what she was capable of when the formal architecture of crediting and compensation was not in the room. She walked in, heard what was being built, added something to it that made it different and better, and left. The people who were there remember it. The recording exists. Her name is not on it in any official capacity. This pattern, contribution without credit, a presence without acknowledgement, was not unique to Cass Elliot in the music industry of that era. It was structurally common for women, and it was particularly common for women whose public image had been established in a way that made certain kinds of seriousness seem incongruous. But it accumulated. Each instance of it settled into the larger account of what she was owed and was not receiving, and the account was growing in ways that did not simplify her relationship to the work or to the people she was doing the work around. Her solo deal with Dunhill was not renewed after the second album underperformed. She moved to RCA. The third album, Make Your Own Kind of Music, was released in 1969 and produced a hit single of the same name that reached the top 20. The song, assertive, declarative, and about doing what you believe in regardless of what anyone else thinks, was received as a statement of personal philosophy. Interviewers asked her about it as though she had written it. She had not written it. The song was written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil. She sang it with conviction because she was a professional who sang everything with conviction, and possibly because the sentiment was not entirely foreign to her experience, and the audience heard in it what they needed to hear. What they needed to hear, apparently, was Mama Cass telling them it was all right to be different. The song functioned as a kind of anthem for people who felt outside the mainstream, which was, on some level, a reasonable response to the particular quality of her voice and her presence. But it also locked her more firmly into the role of the person who reassures others about their outsider status while her own outsider status remains unaddressed. She was the one telling you it was fine to be on the margins. Nobody was telling her. There is a photograph taken at a party in Laurel Canyon sometime in 1969. The exact date is uncertain. What is certain is the composition: a large room, soft lighting, perhaps 20 people in various configurations of conversation and comfort, and at the center of it, occupying a space that the rest of the room appears to have organized itself around without anyone deciding to do so. Cass Elliot. She is laughing. Someone near her is laughing. Two people behind her are mid-conversation but angled slightly toward her, and as though her orbit has a mild gravitational pull they have not noticed themselves responding to. She is holding a glass. She is wearing something loose and colorful. She looks, in the photograph, like a woman who is exactly where she wants to be. What photographs cannot hold is duration. How long she stood in that spot. What she did when the party thinned and the last guests left and the house, which had been full of other people's energy for hours, went quiet. What the morning looked like after a night of being the center that everyone else organized around. By 1969 and into 1970, the Laurel Canyon house had become something close to an institution in the social world of Los Angeles music. This was not accidental. Cass maintained it deliberately, kept the kitchen stocked, kept the door effectively open, kept the atmosphere of the place calibrated to a specific kind of ease that people found difficult to replicate elsewhere. Graham Nash has described arriving there during the period when Crosby, Stills, and Nash were forming and finding it a place where work and friendship were not separated, where you could sit at the piano and someone would come and sit next to you and something would happen that hadn't existed before. David Crosby has said similar things. Joni Mitchell, who lived nearby and moved through the Canyon's social world with somewhat more self-protective distance than some of her peers, was nonetheless a presence in Cass's circle. These were not peripheral people. These were people at the center of what American popular music was becoming in those years. Cass fed them. This is meant literally. She cooked for people. Unassembled meals made the physical act of gathering feel like something worth doing. In an era when the mythology of the bohemian artist involved a certain cultivated indifference to domestic comfort, the unwashed coffee cup, the mattress on the floor, the refrigerator containing only beer and old takeout, Cass's house offered something different. It was warm in the way that requires effort. It was hospitable in the way that requires planning. Someone had to do the work of making it that way, and that someone was her. The labor of hospitality is rarely counted in the accounting of what a person contributes to the world they inhabit. The meals are eaten and forgotten. The conversations that happen over them are remembered as conversations, not as the products of a specific environment that someone maintained at personal cost. The people who passed through Cass's house in those years remember the house fondly, remember the atmosphere with genuine warmth, and the one whose labor produced that atmosphere is remembered in most accounts as someone who simply was that way, as though warmth and generosity of that scale are natural phenomena rather than chosen, sustained efforts that take something out of the person doing the choosing. She was also, during this period, managing a solo career that was not going as well as she needed it to. The RCA deal had produced one significant single and an album that sold adequately without breaking through to the level of success that would have given her the leverage to renegotiate the terms on which she was operating. The fourth solo album, Cass Elliot, released in 1972, was her most personal record. She had more input into the material, more control over the production direction, and the result was something that the people who loved her voice considered her best work. It sold poorly. The label's promotional investment was minimal. The record appeared and was not particularly heard, which in the music industry of that era was almost the same as not existing. The financial situation was more complicated than it appeared from the outside. The house, the lifestyle, the open-door policy toward a social world that contained a significant number of people who were happy to be fed and housed and entertained without examining too carefully who was absorbing the cost. All of this required money, and the money required work, and the work was not always generating the returns that the expenditure demanded. As she owed significant sums to the IRS during this period, a fact reported in several accounts of her life and confirmed by people who were close to her financially at the time. The tax debt was not the result of extravagance in the simple sense. It was the result of the gap between what she earned in peak years and what she continued to spend in the years when the earning was less reliable, plus the particular American cruelty of a tax system that treats irregular income with a consistency the income itself does not have. She managed this largely alone. There were managers and accountants at various points, but the accounts of people who knew her suggest that the professional infrastructure around her was never as solid as it needed to be, that she was making significant financial decisions without adequate counsel, that the people who should have been protecting her interests were either incompetent or not sufficiently invested in those interests to do the job well. This is a common story for musicians of that era, particularly those who had entered the industry young and had never been taught the mechanics of the business side. It is also a story with a particular inflection for women who were more likely to find themselves in relationships with managers and label executives who held more information than they shared and who made decisions on their behalf that primarily served other interests. The television work continued and expanded. She guest hosted The Tonight Show in 1973, one of the first women to do so, sitting in the chair that Johnny Carson occupied most nights and holding the broadcast together with the particular combination of intelligence and ease that made her good at live television. The appearance was reviewed well. It demonstrated something that people in the industry who were paying attention had understood for years, that she could do more than sing, that the performing intelligence she possessed was broader than any single format could contain. There was conversation about her hosting her own show. The conversation did not produce a show. Why it did not is not entirely clear from the available record. What is clear is that the entertainment industry of the early 1970s was not in the habit of building franchises around women who looked like Cass Elliot. The calculation being made in the rooms where these decisions happened was not about talent or about demonstrated ability, both of which she had provided evidence of repeatedly in public, but about the image that would appear on the screen week after week and what that image would mean for the product being sold around it. She was funny and warm and visibly intelligent, and none of these things were sufficient to overcome the industry's conviction that her appearance made her unsuitable for the kind of sustained central visibility that hosting a weekly television program would require. She knew this. She discussed it in interviews with a candor that was careful, not bitter, not accusatory, but precise. She named the problem without naming it as discrimination, which would have been the language available to her if she had chosen to use it, and which she did not choose to use, possibly because using it would have made her difficult, and difficult women did not get the second and third chances that her career still required. She positioned it instead as a challenge to be worked around, a constraint to be managed, the kind of obstacle that persistence and talent could eventually erode. She had been managing constraints of this specific kind since she was 11 years old. She had practice. What the practice did not prevent was the accumulation of the cost of performing ease when ease is not what you feel, The cost of being the person who makes every room more comfortable while the people in the room do not register that comfort as something provided rather than something ambient. The cost of organizing your social world around a style of generosity that gives others what they need while making it structurally difficult for you to ask for what you need, because the role you have established is the role of the giver, and stepping outside, it risks the belonging the role provides. Her weight fluctuated significantly during this period. She had lost a substantial amount of weight in the late 1960s. Accounts vary on the precise amount, but it was significant enough to change her appearance noticeably. The weight loss was produced through methods that were not sustainable and that her body did not maintain over time. When she regained weight, the response from the industry was exactly what she had understood it would be. The opportunities that had briefly expanded contracted again. The television discussions became less frequent. The calculation about her suitability for sustained central visibility was recalibrated in the direction it had always been inclined. What the industry's response to her thinner body had briefly made visible was something she had perhaps already suspected, that the warmth and humor and voice and intelligence were not, in themselves, what she was being evaluated on. They were tolerated, appreciated, commercially useful up to a point. But the primary evaluation was of her body, and the body was a problem that could not be permanently solved by a voice that was the best in the room. The voice was always the best in the room. The room kept finding reasons not to say so. Owen was 6, 7, 8 years old during these years, old enough to be aware of her mother's work, of the famous people who passed through their house, of the particular atmosphere of a home organized around a parent whose social obligations were extensive and whose emotional energy was distributed across a very wide network. Children of that age understand more than they are given credit for about the emotional temperature of the adults around them. What Owen understood about her mother in those years is something Owen has spoken about carefully in adulthood: the love, the presence when presence was possible, the specific quality of Cass's attention when it was fully directed at her daughter, and the frequency with which it was directed elsewhere. By 1972 and into 1973, Cass was performing in venues that represented a particular kind of repositioning. The concert halls and rock festivals that had defined the previous era of her career were giving way to supper clubs, to hotel engagements, to the circuit of upscale rooms where a different kind of audience came to be entertained in a different register. She was good in these rooms. Her skills translated directly. The warmth and humor that had defined her public persona worked well in intimate settings with audiences who came expecting to have a good evening and were not disappointed. But the venues also represented a trajectory. This was not where the music was. This was where the music went when it was being managed rather than made. She was 30 years old. She had been performing professionally for a decade. Since she had been famous for 7 years and had spent most of those 7 years being valued for a version of herself that was adjacent to what she actually was, close enough to feel like recognition, far enough away to keep the actual recognition just out of reach. The house in Laurel Canyon was still full of people. The people still came. The kitchen was still stocked. The door still effectively open, the atmosphere still calibrated to that specific quality of ease that required someone to work to produce it. She was still doing the work. Denny Doherty gave an interview in the 1990s in which he was asked directly about Cass's feelings for him. He confirmed what had been understood by everyone in their circle for decades, that she had loved him, that the love had been real and sustained and unreturned in the way she needed it returned, and that he had known this while it was happening. He said he had not known what to do with it. He said this with what appeared to be genuine regret, the kind that arrives after enough time has passed, that the original situation can be examined without the defensiveness that proximity requires. What he did not say, and what the interviewer did not press him on, was what it had been like for Cass to spend years in close professional and personal contact with someone who held her feelings carefully and did nothing with them. The shape of her romantic life, from her early 20s through her death at 32, is a record of distance maintained at close range. The men she was drawn to were, with a consistency that suggests something more than coincidence, men who were unavailable in one way or another. emotionally, practically, legally, and temperamentally. Doherty was the most significant and the most sustained of these, but he was not the only instance of the pattern. She moved toward people who could offer something real but not everything, and she organized herself around what was available rather than pushing for what was not. This is not an unusual pattern. It is, in fact, a recognizable shape that forms in people who have learned early that their needs are too large for the space they are permitted to occupy, that asking for everything will result in receiving nothing, and that receiving something partial is a better outcome than the risk of total refusal. Ellen Cohen had learned this in Baltimore, in the school hallways, in the living room with her mother's silences. Cass Elliot carried the learning forward into every room she entered as an adult, including the rooms where love was theoretically available. The marriage to James Hendricks had ended legally by the mid-1960s, dissolving as quietly as it had formed. There had been other relationships in the years of the mamas and the papas, names that appear in different accounts with varying levels of specificity, men from the music world, men from the broader social world of Los Angeles, connections that lasted months or a year and then did not. She spoke about these relationships rarely, and when she did, obliquely, with the humor that was her default register for discussing anything that mattered too much for direct address. She made jokes about being unlucky in love in the way that people make jokes about things that are not funny to them, offering the audience a version of the pain that has been processed into entertainment before it can be witnessed raw. Owen Vanessa Elliot was born on April 26, 1967. Her father's identity was not disclosed by Cass publicly during her lifetime. Various names have been suggested in accounts written after her death, none confirmed with certainty. What is documented is that Cass made a deliberate decision not to attach Owen to a specific paternal narrative, which could mean several things: that the relationship had been brief or complicated or painful, that the man involved had not wanted acknowledgement, that Cass had decided her daughter's story would not be organized around an absence with a name. Owen has spoken about this in adulthood with the measured quality of someone who has made peace with an incomplete record, although peace and satisfaction are not the same thing. What Cass provided as a parent was intense when it was present and interrupted when it was not. The interruptions were professional: touring schedules, recording sessions, television commitments, and the intensity, when it arrived, was real. People who knew them together describe a mother whose attention to her daughter was genuine and focused, who could enter the register of a child's world and be fully in it, who made Owen feel in those moments like the most important person in the room. The room was also, frequently, a room full of other people because Cass did not significantly alter the social architecture of her life after Owen's birth. The child grew up in a house where famous people were a normal feature of the environment, where the boundary between professional and personal was minimal, where her mother's warmth was a resource distributed widely rather than concentrated narrowly. In 1971, Cass married Donald von Wiedenmann, a German baron. The marriage lasted approximately a year. The accounts of why she entered it vary. Some suggest genuine feeling, others suggest the same practical emotional logic of her first marriage, a reaching for the structure of partnership in the absence of the feeling that should ideally precede it. Von Wiedenmann was not a figure in the music world. He was not someone whose professional orbit intersected with hers in the way that most of her significant relationships did. The marriage existed somewhat outside the context that defined the rest of her life, which may have been part of its appeal and part of its failure. She needed someone who understood what her life was, and someone who existed entirely outside it was unlikely to manage that understanding without significant effort on both sides. The divorce was quiet. She did not discuss it extensively in interviews. It receded into the background of a life that was generating enough other material to discuss, and the music press of the early 1970s was not particularly interested in the private lives of women whose commercial moment had partially passed. The attention that had followed her in 1966 and 1967, when the mamas and the papas were at their peak, had contracted to a level that tracked her career without examining her life very carefully. She had more privacy in those years than she had had at the height of the group's fame, which was both a relief and a measure of something she tried not to measure. The loneliness of those years is documented indirectly through the accounts of people who were close to her and who have spoken about it in retrospect with the clarity that comes from knowing how the story ends. She was not visibly unhappy in the way that unhappiness makes itself known in public. She was not withdrawn or difficult or erratic in the ways the music industry tended to notice and respond to in its performers. She was, if anything, more entertaining, more generous, more reliably present as the social center of whatever room she was in. The performance of ease had become so practiced that it was difficult to locate the boundary between the performance and the person performing it, which may have been true for her as well as for the people around her. She spoke to a therapist during this period, a detail mentioned in passing in one of the more careful biographical accounts of her life. The specifics of what was discussed are not available, as they should not be. What is available is the fact of it, that she was engaged in a private effort to examine something that the public version of her life did not address, that the work of understanding herself was happening in a room separate from the room where she was always performing ease. This separation, the private labor of self-examination conducted alongside the public performance of contentment, is itself a kind of loneliness. You are doing the real work in a room no one else enters. In 1972, she met and became involved with a man named Billy Donovan. The relationship lasted longer than most of the others, several years, extending into the final period of her life. Donovan was younger than her and was not a significant figure in the music industry. He appears in accounts of her life as someone who was genuinely present, who cared about her, who offered something that the more glamorous connections of her earlier life had not. Whether the relationship was what she had wanted, whether it approximated the feeling she had spent years looking for in the wrong directions, is not something the available record makes clear. What is clear is that she was still looking, still trying, still organizing her emotional life around the hope that the version of love she had not yet managed to sustain was possible. Owen was school-age by the early 1970s, so entering the years when a child's relationship with their parents begins to shift from pure need toward something more complex, when the child starts to see the parent as a person with a life separate from the parental role, and when the quality of that separate life begins to matter in new ways. What Owen saw was a mother who was working hard, who was loved by many people, who was funny and warm and present in the ways her schedule permitted. She also saw a mother whose own emotional needs were being met incompletely, whose private life was organized around a series of connections that never quite solidified into the stability that might have changed the texture of their household. Children notice the difference between a parent who is loved in the way they need to be loved and a parent who is managing. Cass managed. This was the skill she had developed across 30 years of living in situations that required more than they offered. She absorbed the gap between what was available and what was needed, and she filled it with generosity toward others, with humor, with the sustained production of an environment that made everyone around her feel better than they had felt before they arrived. The gap itself remained. It was not filled by the people she fed or the famous names that passed through her living room or the applause that followed her from stage to stage across the years. In the interviews from this period, she spoke frequently about the future, about what she wanted to do next, about the acting work she hoped to pursue more seriously, about her daughter, and about the kind of life she imagined having when the current configuration of things had settled into something more stable. The future was consistently a place where things would be better, where the career would be what she wanted it to be, where the personal life would have the shape she had not yet managed to give it, where the distance between who she was in private and who she was required to be in public would be smaller. She was 31 years old when she played her final full concert run, 32 when she died. The future she described in those interviews was still future when her heart stopped. The settling she was waiting for had not happened. The stability had not arrived. The version of her life that was going to be easier, more recognized, more reciprocal, She was still moving toward it. She was still organizing the present around its anticipated arrival, still performing in the rooms where she was known and valued for a version of herself that was real but incomplete. The last significant relationship of her life was with a man who was present and who cared about her, and it was not enough, and she knew it was not enough, and she kept it anyway, because keeping something incomplete was the habit of a lifetime, and habits do not dissolve simply because you understand where they come from. In the spring of 1968, photographs began appearing in music magazines that prompted a specific kind of attention. Cass Elliot had lost a significant amount of weight. Estimates in various accounts range from 40 to 80 pounds. The imprecision itself a reflection of how casually her body had always been tracked by people who had not been asked to track it. The photographs showed a woman whose face was the same but whose silhouette had changed enough that the change was the first thing people commented on. The reviews of her performances that season mentioned it. The interviews asked about it. The industry, which had spent 2 years treating her body as a liability, responded to its alteration with something that looked, from a distance, like enthusiasm. What the enthusiasm actually was relief. The industry had not changed its position on Cass Elliot. It had simply found, temporarily, that the position no longer required defending. She was smaller, and therefore the machinery could engage with her more fully, and the engagement was framed as appreciation but was more precisely the withdrawal of an obstacle. She had not become more talented. She had not become funnier or warmer or more capable of holding a room or more technically accomplished in a studio. She had become a shape that created fewer problems for the people making decisions about how to deploy her, and those people expressed their relief as celebration, and she received it as such because what else was she going to do with it? The weight loss had been achieved through methods that were, depending on the account, a combination of dietary restriction and what some sources describe as a period of eating very little while working at the pace her schedule demanded. She was touring and recording through this period. The body was being asked to perform at a high level while being given significantly less than it needed to do so. This is not a sustainable arrangement, and her body did not sustain it. Over the following year and into 1969 and 1970, the weight returned, and with it the industry's recalibrated distance. She had watched this happen before, not to herself but to women around her, to the performers whose careers she had observed since childhood, and whose fates had illustrated the specific economics of female appearance in the entertainment industry. She understood the mechanism. She had understood it for years. Understanding it did not protect her from experiencing it, and experiencing it in her own body, watching the industry's enthusiasm contract in direct proportion to her regained weight. That was a different kind of knowledge than understanding it abstractly. Her doctors spoke to her about her weight during this period. This is documented in several accounts with the specificity that suggests it was a recurring rather than occasional conversation. The medical concern was genuine. She was a woman in her late 20s carrying significant excess weight, and the cardiovascular implications of that were real and were being communicated to her by people whose job it was to communicate them. She received this information and she continued to live as she lived, which is not the same as ignoring it. It is the behavior of someone who has a complicated relationship with her own body, who has been taught since childhood that her body is primarily a problem to be managed. And for whom the management strategies available, sustained deprivation, radical restriction, the chronic labor of fighting against what her body naturally did, were not things she had found it possible to maintain across time. The relationship between Cass Elliot and her body was not a simple story about discipline or its absence. It was a story about a woman who had spent her entire life being told that the body she inhabited was wrong. Wrong for the culture, wrong for the industry, wrong for the image the mamas and the papas needed to project, wrong for the television that might have given her the career she wanted, a wrong for the romantic relationships she hoped for, and who had internalized this information with the thoroughness that comes from receiving it repeatedly from sources she had been conditioned to regard as authoritative. Her mother, her peers, her bandmates, her label, the press, the camera, the industry's silence when she was large, and its sudden engagement when she was smaller. There is a particular cruelty in a culture that tells a person their body is a problem and simultaneously makes the solution to that problem the central condition of their access to the things they need, professionally, socially, romantically. It is not a cruelty that announces itself. It operates through normal transactions, through the ordinary mechanics of a world that has made certain preferences into standards and certain standards into requirements. Cass moved through this world and felt its pressure in every professional interaction, every casting decision, every camera angle, every joke made by someone who thought her body was available for public comment. She made the jokes first. This had always been her strategy, to occupy the available narrative before someone else could occupy it unfavorably. She was fat, and she knew it, and she said so in a way that preempted pity or contempt by offering comedy instead. The comedy was skillful. It was also in the way that all preemptive self-deprecation is, a surrender. You are agreeing to the terms of the joke before anyone else sets them. You are confirming that your body is a legitimate subject for humor. You are doing it yourself so that others cannot do it to you first, which is a more sophisticated position than being the passive target, but is still a position organized around the premise that the joke is justified. By the early 1970s, the crash diets had become a recurring feature of her life. Periods of significant restriction followed by periods of regain, the cycle that medical understanding would later identify as metabolically damaging and psychologically exhausting and practically counterproductive in the long term. At the time, in the framework available to her, each new attempt at significant weight loss was framed as a fresh start, a solution in progress, the management of a problem that was simply requiring more sustained effort than previous attempts had achieved. The people around her encouraged the attempts, which was the thing the people who cared about her were able to offer that felt like help and was not entirely help. In 1972, she lost weight again. The second significant loss was achieved through methods similar to the first. Restriction, sustained below what the body required, maintained across a period long enough to produce visible results. She was thinner by 1973 than she had been since her early 20s. The photographs from this period show a woman whose face has the slightly drawn quality that accompanies significant weight loss, whose body has the quality of having been worked on rather than arrived at. She spoke about the weight loss in interviews with a directness that contained its own performance. Here is what I did. Here's how it feels. Here's the version of my life that this opens up. And the industry responded again in the way it had responded before. The doors that had been closed or partially open swung wider. The television conversations became more serious. The Las Vegas bookings that would define the last phase of her career became possible, partly because the venues that had been hesitant about her appearance found the new configuration more manageable. She was still large, by the standards the industry applied. She was less large than she had been, and less large was sufficient to alter the calculus in ways that had nothing to do with what she could do and everything to do with what she looked like doing it. She played the Palladium in London for the first time in 1973. The engagement was a success. The British press, which had its own complicated relationship with female bodies, but which had also maintained a different relationship with Cass's talent than the American industry, received her warmly. The reviews were specific about her voice in a way that American reviews sometimes forgot to be. They described what she actually did, technically and expressively, in ways that suggested the critics had listened to the performance rather than evaluated the performer. She responded to this with the particular pleasure of someone receiving a kind of attention they have wanted for a long time and have not been certain they deserved. The Las Vegas shows that ran through 1973 placed her in a context that was simultaneously prestigious and limiting. Las Vegas in the early 1970s was where certain kinds of careers went. Careers that had reached a level of recognition sufficient to fill those rooms, but that the mainstream music industry had decided were not going in the direction of its current interests. The audiences were loyal and enthusiastic and demographically different from the rock audiences that had defined her earliest solo work. She was good in those rooms. She was always good in whatever room she was in. The goodness was not sufficient to make her forget where those rooms were positioned in the hierarchy of places a performer could be. Her heart was under strain. This is documented medically. Her physician during this period has spoken about it in subsequent accounts, about the conversations they had about cardiovascular risk, about the weight's effect on cardiac function, about the need for her to make changes that she was not making or was making in ways that were insufficient to the scale of the problem. The medical record is partial. Her private health information belongs to her and to the people she chose to share it with, but the outline is visible. A woman in her early 30s with a heart working harder than it should, in a body that had been asked repeatedly to undergo rapid change, living at a pace and stress level that the cardiovascular system did not find restful. She did not rest. This is perhaps the most consistent fact of her professional life from 1966 through 1974. She did not stop. The working was financial necessity and professional strategy, and also, almost certainly, the thing that kept the inside of the house from being too quiet. A working life is a structured life. A structured life has less room in it for the things that arrive in silence, the accounting of what has not been given, the audit of what has not been received, the particular quality of loneliness that is most audible when no one is talking. In early 1974, she began planning what would become her final London engagement. The Palladium run in July was designed as a statement. 2 weeks of sold-out shows, the kind of sustained engagement that demonstrated an audience rather than a moment, that proved something about the durability of what she had built, even in the years when the industry had been intermittently indifferent. She was thinner than she had been at the height of the mamas and the papas. She was 32 years old. She was planning the engagement with the energy of someone who believes they are building towards something, who has located, in the work, the forward momentum that other parts of her life had not consistently provided. Her body had been the story for as long as she had been visible. It had been the first thing people saw and the last thing they stopped talking about. It had been the condition placed on her access to the industry's interest and the subject of its jokes when that interest was withdrawn. It had been managed and restricted and altered and discussed and scrutinized and laughed at and praised and scrutinized again. It had also, through all of this, held one of the finest voices of her generation, had carried that voice onto stages and into recording studios, and through 14 consecutive sold-out performances at the London Palladium, and had then, on the morning of July 29, 1974, simply stopped. The International Hotel in Las Vegas seated several hundred people per show. The tables were set with glasses, and the glasses were filled before the performance began, and the audience arrived in the particular state of preparedness that Las Vegas audiences arrived in, already entertained in the general sense, already at a remove from their ordinary lives, already disposed toward enjoying whatever was placed in front of them. This was not the worst environment for a performer. It was also not the environment that had produced the music Cass Elliot had spent her life making. The coffee houses of Washington, D.C., the studio sessions in Los Angeles where something unexpected could happen if the right people were in the room at the right time. The stages where an audience was present because they had specifically chosen to be, because they had a relationship with the work rather than with the general concept of an evening's entertainment. She played Las Vegas beginning in earnest in 1972 and continued through 1973 and into 1974. The bookings were well-paying, which mattered because the financial situation had not significantly simplified since the tax difficulties of the late 1960s. The IRS debt had been managed rather than resolved, payments arranged, obligations restructured, the ongoing negotiation that characterizes the financial lives of people who earn irregularly and spend consistently. The Las Vegas money was reliable in a way that recording advances and touring revenues were not. You knew what you were going to be paid. You knew when you were going to be paid. In a professional life that had been characterized by significant uncertainty in both directions, this was not nothing. The shows she built for these engagements were carefully constructed. She was not simply standing at a microphone and singing, though the singing was sufficient on its own terms. She had developed a performance that incorporated her humor, her storytelling, the persona she had been refining since childhood, warm, self-aware, in genuine communication with the audience, making the people in the room feel that they were being spoken to rather than performed at. She told stories about her life that were versions of the truth, shaped for comic effect, offering the audience enough intimacy to feel privileged without giving them anything that actually cost her. This was a skill. And it was a skill that required constant maintenance and that consumed in the maintaining a kind of energy that is difficult to replenish. The people who saw her in those rooms remember the shows as exceptional. This is consistent across enough independent accounts to be treated as accurate, rather than as the retrospective inflation that sometimes accompanies the memories of people who knew someone who died young. She was doing something genuinely good in those Vegas rooms, something that the format did not make easy. The format tended to produce a particular kind of performance, polished, distant, professional in the sense of being thoroughly managed. And what she was producing was different from that. It was present. It was alive in the way that presence makes performances alive. What the format also produced was isolation. Las Vegas in the early 1970s was not Laurel Canyon. The social world available to a performer playing a hotel engagement was the world of the hotel. Other performers, hotel staff, the management structure of the venue, and the audience, which arrived and departed and was replaced by another audience the following night. The Laurel Canyon house was in Los Angeles. Owen was in Los Angeles. The network of friendships that had structured her social life for the better part of a decade was in Los Angeles. When she was in Las Vegas, she was in a place that had been designed at its architectural and commercial foundations to prevent people from developing a sense of where they actually were. She brought people with her when she could. She called Los Angeles constantly. This detail appears in multiple accounts of the period. The phone bills that accumulated, the hours spent maintaining connections across distance that the work created. The calls were long, often late at night after the show when the particular quiet of a hotel room in Las Vegas, which is a specific and somewhat aggressive quiet, the quiet of a place that has been designed to have no interior life, settled in, and the alternative to calling someone was being alone with it. Owen was 6, 7 years old during this period, old enough to register her mother's absences not as incomprehensible events but as a recurring pattern with a shape she could anticipate. Cass left for Las Vegas. Cass came home. Cass left again. The departures and returns were handled with the care that Cass brought to everything that involved her daughter. The explanations appropriate to a child's understanding. The reassurances that were genuine rather than performed. The concentrated presence she offered when she was home as partial compensation for the periods when she was not. Whether the compensation was experienced by Owen as adequate is a question that belongs to Owen. The reinvention that Las Vegas represented was not only professional, it was also a shift in the identity she was performing, away from the rock and folk world that had made her famous, away from the Laurel Canyon social scene that had defined the previous decade, toward a register of entertainment that was older in its conventions and more conservative in its aesthetics. The audiences in those hotel rooms were not the audiences who had bought California Dreamin' or who had known the mamas and the papas as something new and exciting and representative of a cultural moment. They were audiences for whom Cass Elliot was a name attached to a warm, funny, large woman who could really sing, which was enough, which was in some ways more straightforwardly appreciative than the more complicated attention she had received in earlier years. She was also, during this period, beginning to think more seriously about the acting work she had always wanted to do. The television appearances had demonstrated something that she and the people around her believed could be developed further, a camera presence that was immediate and specific, a quality of naturalism in performance that did not look like performance. She had done guest spots on variety programs and talk shows throughout her career, and in each of these, she had demonstrated an ease in front of a camera that many trained actors spend years trying to acquire and never fully do. The question was whether the industry would allow her to be seen as an actress rather than as a singer who appeared on television, which was a different category with different implications for the kinds of roles she might be offered. In 1973, she appeared in a television film called Don't Call Me Mama Anymore. The title was deliberate. It was an explicit attempt to create distance from the Mama Cass persona that had defined her public identity for 7 years, an announcement of a different version of herself that she was trying to make available. The film received limited attention. The attempt to reframe her identity was not invisible, but it was also not successful in the sense of producing the sustained recategorization she was working toward. The industry received the gesture and filed it under the existing category rather than opening a new one. The name itself was a problem she had been living with for years. Mama Cass. She had not chosen it. It had attached itself to her through the group, through the image the group had projected, through the specific role she had occupied within that image. It was warm and it was limiting in equal measure. It suggested someone maternal, comforting, broad in every sense. A presence rather than a person, a type rather than an individual. She was trying in the early 1970s to be Cass Elliot, which was the name she had given herself in the early 1960s to replace the name her mother had given her, which was itself a different kind of claim on identity. But Mama Cass was stickier than Cass Elliot. It had entered the culture at a moment of significant saturation, and it had stayed. The financial pressure increased through 1973. The Las Vegas engagements were paying well, but the overhead of her life, the house, the staff, the ongoing support of a social network that had never been organized around the principle of reciprocity, was significant. There were conversations during this period about selling the Laurel Canyon house, about simplifying the domestic infrastructure, about aligning the expenditure more closely with the actual income. These conversations did not produce immediate action. The house had been the center of a world she had built carefully over a decade, and dismantling it was not a simple financial decision. She was also managing, throughout this period, her ongoing health concerns with the same partial attention she had always given them. The cardiovascular situation had not improved. The weight loss she had achieved in 1972 and 1973 had stabilized at a level that was better than her peak weight, but that still represented significant strain on her heart. She was smoking. She was not sleeping enough. She was working at a pace that would have been demanding for a person in optimal health, and that was, for a woman whose heart was already working harder than it should, something that her doctors were actively concerned about. She spoke about the future in interviews from 1973 and early 1974 with the specific quality that marks those accounts now, the quality of someone describing a future that the reader knows will not arrive. She talked about slowing down. She talked about spending more time with Owen. She talked about the acting work she was going to pursue more seriously when the current run of commitments was completed. She talked about writing. She had always wanted to write, not music necessarily, but something, some form that would allow her to work in a more private register, to put something down that was not required to be entertaining in the moment of its reception. The London Palladium engagement in July 1974 was booked as the culmination of a particular phase of work, the end of a run of Las Vegas and concert engagements that had been building towards something more significant. She had played the Palladium the previous year, and the response had been strong enough that a return booking was secured. 2 weeks, 14 shows. The kind of sustained engagement that meant something different from a single night or a weekend. It meant an audience that came back, that told other people, that filled the seats not through promotional machinery alone, but through the transmission of actual experience. She arrived in London in July 1974 and moved into the flat that Harry Nilsson had made available. Nilsson was a friend. The flat was in Mayfair. Why, the arrangement was the kind of informal hospitality that characterized the music world of that era. She began rehearsals. The people who were present for those rehearsals have described a woman who was in good spirits, focused, professional, engaged with the work in a way that suggested she was bringing her full attention to what she was doing, rather than going through motions she had performed too many times to find interesting. The shows began. The audiences filled the Palladium every night. The reviews were exceptional. The British press that had always maintained a more specific relationship with her talent than the American industry wrote about what she was doing with a precision that must have felt. Reading those reviews in a hotel room after a show, like being seen in a way she had not always been seen. She was being described as a performer of genuine magnitude, not a personality, not a type, a performer. She called Los Angeles, she called Owen, she called friends. The calls, by the accounts of people who received them, had a quality of lightness that was real rather than performed. She was happy in the specific way that people are happy when work is going well, when the thing they have built over years is producing the result they hoped it would produce. There was also in some of those calls a tiredness that the people who loved her registered and noted to themselves and did not know what to do with. The final performance was on July 28th. The audience gave her what audiences give performers they know they have witnessed at the height of their powers, the kind of sustained, a specific applause that is not simply approval but recognition. She took her bows. She left the stage. She returned to the Nielsen flat. 4 days later, on the afternoon of August 1st, her personal assistant found her in bed. The ham sandwich story was circulating within hours. It was wrong. It has been wrong for 50 years. Her actual cause of death was heart failure, the heart that had been under strain for years, that her doctors had been speaking to her about, that had been carrying the weight of a life lived at a specific pitch and pace, simply stopped. She was 32 years old. Owen was 7. The Las Vegas rooms were already booking their next acts. The Laurel Canyon house was still full of the objects she had accumulated across a decade of building a life there. The future she had been describing in interviews, slower and more intentional, more fully hers, had not arrived. The flat at 9 Curzon Place in Mayfair was not hers. Harry Nilsson had offered it, and she had accepted, and this was the ordinary texture of how things were arranged in the world she inhabited. Generosity offered informally, accepted informally. The infrastructure of a life assembled from the goodwill of people who happened to have what you needed at the moment you needed it. The flat was comfortable. It was in a good neighborhood. It was the kind of place that communicated through its address and its furnishings a level of arrival that was real but borrowed. She was staying in someone else's evidence of success, while her own success was being demonstrated nightly at the Palladium 8 minutes away. She had been in London since late June, arriving several weeks before the engagement began to allow time for rehearsals, for the particular recalibration that performing in a different country requires, for the adjustment of material and pacing to an audience whose rhythms were slightly different from the American audiences she knew most thoroughly. She worked with her musicians through the early weeks of July with the focused attention that people who saw those rehearsals have described consistently. She knew what she wanted the shows to be. She had specific ideas about how to achieve it, and she communicated those ideas with a directness that had developed over the years from the more tentative professional manner of her early career into something that looked, by 1974, like authority. The Palladium had a specific weight in the history of the kind of performing she did. It was not a rock venue. It was not a festival stage. It was a theater with a history of presenting performers at the level of sustained, serious entertainment. The kind of place where Judy Garland had performed, where performers of an older generation had come to demonstrate that what they did was more than commercial product, that it had the quality of something worth witnessing carefully. Coming back to the Palladium for a second engagement, filling it for 2 consecutive weeks meant something in that specific lineage of meaning. She was aware of this. The awareness was part of what made those 2 weeks feel different from other stretches of work. The first night was July 15th. The reviews appeared the following morning, and the accounts left by people who read them described Cass reading them with the pleasure of someone who had been waiting a long time to be described accurately. The critics wrote about the voice, specifically, technically, with the attention usually reserved for performers whose talent was not in any doubt. They wrote about her command of the room, about the way she managed the transition between the musical and comedic registers of her performance without the seam showing, about the quality of presence that made the large theater feel like somewhere intimate. One review used the word formidable. She kept that review. The shows settled into a rhythm across the first week. as she knew the material deeply enough that the performances could breathe, could respond to the specific quality of each night's audience without losing their shape. She added things. She dropped things. She told different versions of the same stories depending on what the room seemed to want, which was a skill that only develops across years of paying close attention to what happens when you say something, and then waiting to see how it lands. The audiences came back. People who had been on the first night returned for the second or third, bringing people they had told about it. This is the mechanism by which certain performances become something more than entertainment. They generate the specific testimony that makes other people feel they need to witness them. Owen called from Los Angeles. Cass called back in the evenings after the shows, when the adrenaline of the performance was still in her system and the quiet of the flat had not yet settled into its own weight. The calls were warm by the accounts of people who were present for some of them. Easy, funny, with the quality of two people who have found a way to be in each other's company across distance that does not feel like a diminishment of the closeness. Owen was 7. She understood that her mother was working, that the work was going well, that she would be home when it was finished. What she was too young to understand was that the conversations had a specific texture produced by her mother's exhaustion, genuine warmth over a foundation of tiredness that the warmth was carrying. Cass was sleeping poorly, and this is documented in the accounts of people who spent time with her during those 2 weeks. Not dramatically, not in a way that alarmed anyone sufficiently to act, but consistently. She was waking in the night and finding it difficult to return to sleep. The schedule, performing 5 or 6 nights a week at the level of sustained intensity those shows required, maintaining the social obligations that came with a 2-week London engagement, managing the practical logistics of being in a foreign city without the domestic infrastructure of her Los Angeles life, was producing a cumulative tiredness that the performances somehow did not reflect. She left it on the stage. She gave the Palladium audiences the energy she had, and then she went back to the flat, and the energy did not replenish the way it once had. She ate erratically during this period, as she often did when traveling and working simultaneously. The question of what and how much Cass Elliot ate had been a subject of public scrutiny for so long that it had become almost impossible to separate from the noise of everything that had been said about it. The jokes, the concerns, the industry's ongoing evaluation of her body as a professional variable. What her actual nutritional situation was in those London weeks is not something the available record makes fully clear. What is clear is that her body was under the kinds of stress, sustained performance, disrupted sleep, irregular meals, the cardiovascular strain that had been present for years, that compound each other in ways that are not always visible from the outside. The people who spent time with her between shows describe a woman who was in good spirits, but who was also, in the quieter moments, showing something that they identified in retrospect as a kind of deep tiredness that went beyond the physical. Not depression exactly, or not what they recognized as depression. More the tiredness of someone who has been managing a great many things for a very long time and who has not found, in the middle of a triumphant professional engagement, the rest that might have suggested the management was nearly over. She gave an interview during the second week to a British journalist whose account of it was published after her death. The interview was, by the journalist's account, one of the more candid she had ever given. She talked about her daughter, and about what she wanted her career to be in the next phase of her life, about the acting work she was planning to pursue seriously when she returned to Los Angeles. She talked about being tired in a way that was matter of fact rather than alarming. She had been working hard, the work was paying off, she was looking forward to going home. She talked about Owen in a way that the journalist described as the most unguarded moment of the conversation, the place where the professional persona dropped away and something more private was briefly visible. The final performance was on July 28th. The accounts of that night suggest it was the best of the 14. The shows had been building across 2 weeks in the way that sustained engagements sometimes build, with each performance adding something to the accumulated understanding between performer and audience, so that the final night had a quality of completeness that single performances cannot achieve. She sang everything she had. She told the stories she had been telling, and they landed with the precision of material that has been worked to exactly the right level of refinement. She took her bows. The audience gave her the kind of applause that is specific to a particular quality of experience. Not simply approval, not the reflexive response of an audience that has been adequately entertained, but the response of people who understand they have been in the presence of something that will not be exactly repeated. She returned to the flat. She spoke with some people by phone. The accounts of those calls suggest she was happy, tired, or satisfied in the way that the completion of something difficult and successful produces satisfaction. She went to bed. The following days are described in the accounts of people who spoke to her as ordinary days, the particular suspension of time that follows the end of a major professional commitment, when the structure that has organized your life for weeks suddenly dissolves and the days open up into something less defined. She slept. She made plans for returning to Los Angeles. She spoke to Owen. She had conversations about the next phase of work, about the acting possibilities that had been discussed, about the shape of what was coming. On the afternoon of August 1st, her personal assistant came to the flat and found her in bed. She had died in her sleep. The coroner's report identified the cause as heart failure, fatty myocardial degeneration, the specific mechanism through which a heart that has been working beyond its capacity for a sustained period finally gives out. She had not choked. There was no food involved. The story that spread within hours, the ham sandwich, the joke that wrote itself, was a fiction that the press adopted with the speed of people who have been handed something they did not have to work for. The fiction was, in its way, revealing. The story that the culture wanted to tell about Cass Elliot's death was a story about excess, about a woman who had always been too much, who had literally consumed herself, who had died in a way that was essentially comic. This story required no examination of what her life had actually been. It required no attention to the cardiovascular condition that had been present for years, to the pace at which she had been living, to the specific and sustained pressures her body had been under. It required only the existing image, the large, laughing woman, the one who was always the fun one, the one whose relationship with food had been a source of public entertainment for as long as anyone had been paying attention. The image was available, and the story attached itself to the image, and the image was so familiar that nobody looked closely enough to see that the story was wrong. Owen was 7 years old. She was in Los Angeles when her mother died in London. The people who were responsible for telling her what had happened told her what had happened, and she was 7 years old and her mother was not coming home. And the ham sandwich story was already circulating in the press that would define her mother's legacy for the next 50 years. The Palladium had already moved on to the next booking. The flat in Curzon Place belonged to Harry Nilsson, who would also die young, who would die in that same flat, which accumulated its deaths quietly in the way that places sometimes do. The recordings Cass had made across 15 years of professional work sat in the catalogs of the labels that owned them. The voice was in the recordings. The recordings were in the world. She had been 32 years old, and she had been tired, and she had been happy, and she had been planning the next thing, and then she was not. The ham sandwich story was in print within 24 hours of her death. The sourcing was thin, a detail mentioned in passing in early reports, possibly originating from a misreading of the initial scene, possibly from something said carelessly by someone present at the flat who did not understand what they were looking at, possibly from the particular momentum of a narrative that, once started, did not require evidence to continue. The story was that she had choked on a ham sandwich while eating in bed. The story was wrong. The coroner's report was unambiguous. Heart failure. Fatty myocardial degeneration. A heart that had been working beyond its limits for a sustained period and had stopped. The coroner's report was available. It was published. It said clearly what it said, and the ham sandwich story continued to circulate, continued to appear in newspapers and magazines and casual conversations and eventually in the early internet, where misinformation acquires a kind of immortality unavailable to correction. 50 years later, the ham sandwich is still the first thing many people encounter when they encounter Cass Elliot's name. This is not a story about the cruelty of a specific person or the malice of a particular institution. It is a story about what happens when a woman has been reduced to a type so thoroughly that the type becomes more durable than the facts. The type required a specific kind of death. A woman who had been the subject of food jokes for her entire public life, who had been managed and evaluated and dismissed through the lens of her eating, her body, her appetites, could not, in the mythology the culture had constructed around her, simply have a heart attack. That was too ordinary, too medical, too independent of the narrative. The ham sandwich death was a death that fit the Mama Cass image with the precision of a conclusion that had been written into the premise. It was also, and this is the part that settled quietly into the bones of the story, funny. The culture had always found Cass Elliot funny. It found her death funny. The laughter did not stop when she did. Owen Vanessa. Elliot was 7 years old when her mother died and grew up in the specific shadow that a public myth casts over private grief. She did not grow up simply without her mother. She grew up without her mother, while the version of her mother that the culture maintained was a punchline. The ham sandwich joke appeared in her life with the regularity of something that has been normalized. At school, in conversation, eventually on television programs and in books and in the mouths of people who had no idea they were saying it in front of the woman's daughter. Owen has spoken about this in adulthood with the measured quality of someone who has worked hard to find a position that allows her to function alongside the pain rather than being consumed by it. She has also worked, across decades, to correct the record. She has spoken in interviews, participated in documentaries, maintained a public presence oriented partly around ensuring that Cass Elliot is remembered as a musician rather than as a myth. This work, the sustained labor of a daughter trying to return her mother's humanity to a culture that has preferred the caricature, is itself a measure of what the myth cost. It is unpaid work, emotionally expensive, without a clear endpoint because the misinformation it is trying to correct is embedded in a cultural layer that does not respond readily to correction. The estate that Cass left behind was more complicated than her public image suggested. The financial situation at the time of her death was not what the level of her fame implied it should be. The tax obligations that had accumulated during the late 1960s and early 1970s, the overhead of a lifestyle organized around generosity toward a large social network, the unequal distribution of back-end revenue from the mamas and the papas years, all of this had produced a financial position that was not secure in the way that 7 years of significant fame might have been expected to produce. The Laurel Canyon house, which had been the center of a world, passed through the processes of estate administration and eventually left the family's possession. The catalog remained. The recordings she had made across 15 years, with the mamas and the papas across 5 solo albums, in the session work and informal recordings that were scattered through the archives of various studios, were owned by the labels that had contracted them. The money those recordings generated over the following decades, as the music of the 1960s was licensed and repackaged and streamed and repurposed, did not flow primarily to Owen or to whatever legacy Cass had hoped to leave her daughter. It flowed to the companies that had owned the masters, to the estates of the songwriters who had written the material, to the administrative apparatus that sits between a recording and the revenue it generates. John Phillips died in 2001. He had spent the decades after the mamas and the papas in the prolonged disorder of serious addiction, had reformed partially, had produced a second generation of musical offspring, his daughter Mackenzie, his daughter Chinna, whose careers and personal histories were covered by the press with an interest that occasionally circled back to the group that had made the family famous. His estate included the songwriting catalog that had defined the mamas and the papas sound, the publishing revenue from California Dreamin' and Monday Monday, and Dedicated to the One I Love, and the other songs that had made all 4 of them famous. The financial architecture of who owned what remained after his death as during his life. I organized around the decision he had made in 1965 and 1966 to hold the songwriting credits and let the other members hold their salaries. Denny Doherty died in 2007. He had spent significant portions of the intervening decades discussing the mamas and the papas in interviews in a one-man theatrical show he developed and performed called Dream a Little Dream, in the various retrospective projects that the group's enduring commercial appeal continued to generate. The show he built was partly about Cass, about their relationship, about what she had meant to him, about the love she had offered him that he had not known how to receive. He performed it repeatedly across several years, and the accounts of those performances describe something genuine in it. A man working through a reckoning in public that he had not managed in private while she was alive to receive it. That the reckoning happened in a theatrical context, for paying audiences, in a show that generated revenue, is a detail that sits alongside the genuine emotion without canceling it. The love was real. The public processing of the love also had a commercial dimension. These things coexisted in the Mama's and the Papa's story from the beginning, and they coexisted in its aftermath. Michelle Phillips survived them all, the last member of the original group alive as of the time these events can be discussed. She has spoken about Cass in the way that someone speaks about a person they were close to and complicated by, with genuine warmth, with the awareness of specific failures and how that closeness was managed, much with the retrospective generosity that becomes available once the person you failed is no longer present to complicate the generosity with their actual needs. The music itself did not diminish. California Dreamin' is still played on radio stations globally with a frequency that suggests it has entered the category of songs that exist outside their original context, songs that are simply part of the sonic environment of a particular cultural memory, present whether or not you chose to put them there. Cass's voice is in that song and in Dream a Little Dream and in Make Your Own Kind of Music and in the recordings that demonstrated what she could do when the architecture around her gave her room to do it. The voice has aged the way great recorded voices age. It is not diminished, has not become dated in the way that production styles date, retains the specific quality that made people stop what they were doing when they first heard it. The voice is in the recordings, and the recordings are in the culture, but the name attached to the voice is still in a significant portion of the culture, primarily attached to the wrong story, the ham sandwich, the excess, the joke with a voice. The correction has been made repeatedly in documentaries and retrospective pieces and Owen's sustained advocacy, and it has penetrated some portion of the audience and not others. Cultural corrections of this kind travel more slowly than the original misinformation because the original misinformation had the advantage of arriving first, of settling into the memory before the accurate version was available, of having the additional advantage of being a better story in the sense that the culture understands a better story, more compact, more conclusive, more comfortable in its implicit moral. The implicit moral of the ham sandwich story is that Cass Elliot died as she lived, excessively, comically, unable to manage the appetites that had defined her public image. This moral requires her death to be a consequence of her character, rather than the failure of a body that had been under medical strain for years, which would make her death a medical event, rather than a narrative conclusion. The culture preferred the narrative conclusion. Narrative conclusions are more satisfying than medical events. They suggest that the story was always going somewhere, that it arrived where it was supposed to arrive, that the ending was earned by the premises. So the premises that the culture had established for Cass Elliot were the premises of her body, her appetites, her excess. The ending it assigned her fit those premises. That the ending was wrong did not make it less useful. Owen Elliot Kugel, she took her husband's name, adding it to her mother's, has continued to manage the estate, to represent her mother's legacy, to make decisions about how the recordings are used and what contexts they appear in. She has done this work for decades, largely without the financial resources that would have made it easier, with the emotional complexity of someone whose relationship with her mother was real and incomplete and permanently unfinished, in the way that all relationships with parents who die young are permanently unfinished. There are things Owen does not know about her mother. There are things Cass Elliot did not know about her own mother. The transmission of incomplete knowledge across generations is one of the quieter consequences of lives lived at the pace and under the pressures that Cass's life was lived. The conversations that would have happened when Owen was older, the ones in which a daughter asks her mother the questions that are only possible to ask when both parties are adults, did not happen. They were foreclosed at 32 and 7, and the absence of them is a specific kind of loss that does not appear in any accounting of what the myth cost. The Laurel Canyon house is gone, not demolished necessarily, but changed, sold, absorbed into the ongoing transformation of a neighborhood that has been wealthy long enough that the specific era it represented in the 1960s and 1970s is now historical rather than living. The people who gathered there are gone or old or in the position of people for whom the memories of that period have acquired the particular quality of memories that exist outside the normal categories of past and present. Too vivid to be simply past. Too lost to be anything else. What they ate at those gatherings, who cooked it, whose kitchen it was, who did the work of making those evenings possible. This information is in the memories of the people who were there, imperfectly encoded, gradually diminishing. The recordings are more durable than the memories. The myth is more durable than the recordings. The myth is wrong, and it endures. And the voice is in it whether the voice consented to be there or not. What remains is the voice. It is in the recordings, which are owned by companies that were not present at their creation, licensed to platforms that did not exist when they were made, available to anyone with a phone and a subscription in a way that would have been unimaginable to the woman who made them. Dream a Little Dream of Me has been streamed hundreds of millions of times. The voice in it is 32 years old, or 26, or whatever age she was when she stood in front of a microphone and gave the engineers what they needed. The voice does not age in the recording. It stays where it was left. Owen Elliot Kugel is in her 50s now. She gives interviews about her mother with the careful consistency of someone who has been giving them for decades and who has learned, through repetition, which parts of the truth the available formats can hold and which parts they cannot. She corrects the ham sandwich story when it appears. It keeps appearing. She has described growing up without her mother in terms that do not reach for drama. She uses words like absence and incomplete, words that locate the loss in the structure of a life rather than in a single moment of grief. The grief was a single moment. The absence has been continuous. The music world that Cass inhabited, Laurel Canyon, the folk scene, the specific configuration of talent and ambition and informal community that produced so much of what defined American popular music in the 1960s has been documented extensively in the decades since. Books, documentaries, retrospectives, the memoirs of survivors who have reached the age at which the past becomes a primary subject. In most of these accounts, Cass appears warmly, briefly, as a presence whose warmth is remembered more readily than her work. She fed people. She opened her house. She made everyone feel welcome. These are the things said most often, with the most genuine affection, about a woman whose voice was the best in the room. She did not write the songs she sang. She did not own the masters. She did not control the image attached to her name during her lifetime or after it. When she worked for 15 years at an exceptionally high level and died without the financial security that level of work implied, without the acting career she had been planning, without the slower and more intentional version of her life she had been describing in interviews for at least 5 years. She died in someone else's flat, having just completed the best run of performances of her career, and the story that attached itself to her death was a joke. There are questions the record does not answer. Whether she understood fully what the people around her had taken from her, the credits, the back end, the professional respect that her contributions earned and did not receive. Whether the generosity she organized her life around was a genuine expression of who she was or a strategy for belonging that had become indistinguishable from who she was because she had been practicing it since she was 11 years old. Whether the love she spent her life looking for and not quite finding was something she believed was still coming. In the future, she kept describing, or whether she had arrived at some private accommodation with its absence. She was 32. The future was still future. These questions were still open. The voice is in the recordings. It is warm and it is precise, and it contains, in its particular grain, something that cannot be fully accounted for by the circumstances that produced it. The Baltimore childhood, the folk scene, the group that needed her more than it acknowledged, the industry that evaluated her body before her talent, the room she filled with other people's comfort while her own went unaddressed. All of that is in the voice somehow, or behind it, or underneath it. When you hear it, you hear someone who is fully present. Whatever was not given to her, she gave that.